ankündigen, next speaker. We are really glad to having you. Welcome, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss hier in Leipzig. Ich darf Ihnen Frau Miller-Idriss ganz kurz vorstellen. Sie ist Professorin an der American University in Washington D.C. und ist Professorin an der School of Public Affairs and School of Education. Sie befasst sich seit langer Zeit mit verschiedenen Formen von Hasskriminalität, Misogynie beispielsweise, Antifeminismus, hat sich aber auch viel befasst mit Rechtsextremismus in den USA, aber auch in Deutschland. Ich glaube auch nicht die erste Reise nach Deutschland, sondern immer wieder hier. Wunderbar. Und sie ist Direktorin des Parallel, unserem diesjährigen Partner der Fachtagung. Wir freuen uns auf die Worte.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me while we get the slides up. I'm really happy to be here in Leipzig and to have spent a few days in Berlin first. Two quick things. Ich wollte nur sagen, dass man darf natürlich auch Fragen auf Deutsch stellen, and I'll try to answer them in English probably. I know that people are listening to the live stream, but I love the language. It's always good for me to practice, and I love to listen to it. So please ask questions in the language in which you're most comfortable, and during the break, make me use my German, and I'm happy to use it and to try to speak. I also say that for pedagogical reasons, I made these slides a little bit more text-heavy than I usually would, so that English, if you want to read the slides while I'm talking, you can do that, and so that I could also provide them to the interpreters in advance. So normally I try to use more images and talk more freely, but this time I will try to make sure that you can read them or listen to me if you prefer to in English. So, as we know, Americans are statistically very likely to believe conspiracy theories. That goes back to our founding. There's good research showing that Americans are quite prone to conspiracy theories, and in every possible domain. So we have conspiracy theories about rigged elections. We have conspiracy theories that you also have here about the Great Replacement that are anti-Semitic and also anti-feminist. Those have gradually moved into broader so-called replacement theories about Democrats bringing in immigrants to replace voters and secure more power. We have a wide range of anti-feminist and gendered conspiracy theories that I've been analyzing for the last couple of years, including that vegetarian hamburgers are a deliberate effort to create more estrogen in men and create soy boys who will be more compliant to feminist power grabs and reduce testosterone. There are a wide variety of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories believed by wide swaths of Americans about puppet masters bringing in refugees, for example, that have occasionally mobilized violence. QAnon, which I will talk about today, including absurd claims, but nonetheless believed by quite a few large percentages of Americans, that Democrats are eating babies and trafficking in children. As we heard recently, the COVID-19 and vaccine conspiracy theories, including that vaccines were implanting trackers to make Americans more compliant and or be surveilled. And of course, it will be difficult not to get too political in this talk, but we now have appointed officials in the US who are themselves vaccine skeptics or have promoted conspiracy theories as well. We have wide-ranging anti-LGBTQ+ conspiracy theories in local communities in particular about so-called groomers, including librarians who are trying to make kids gay. And then a huge range of non-political and political conspiracy theories ranging from aliens to Lady Di to who killed JFK. And to, I will talk later about cultural Marxism, which actually is becoming a huge problem right now in attacks on science. I want to just highlight 3 parts. In the lab, we design a lot of tools that are strategies to pre-bunk conspiracy theories with short-form video and also educate parents and communities about them and the harm they can do. And we find there are at least 3 common threads that are kind of important to help people understand. One is that there's always a strategy there that is about something sinister, usually involving efforts to create secret hiding of wrongdoing, to deceive, manipulate the public, or secure power. The tactics almost always involve orchestration, right? So conspiring with others to control the outcomes through puppet master type surveillance, spying via drones, monitoring by big tech. And the goals, of course, there are a wide range of perceived goals of these conspiracies, but the ones that we're most worried about are the ones that include things like belief in an intentional effort to collapse Western civilization, to destroy traditional values, to replace majority white nations with multicultural ones, or to control men in order to secure more power for women, minorities, liberals, Democrats, leftists, etc. So I want to talk as an example about how these conspiracy theories in the US are related to one another, in particular by looking at what happened when QAnon morphed into or evolved into a series of election-related conspiracy theories. So QAnon, as you, I'm sure, know, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, is not a single conspiracy theory, but it's really a sprawling web of conspiracies that suggest at its core that there is an orchestrated child pedophile, Satan-worshipping ring run by a cabal of Hollywood elites and political global elites that are loosely organized under some sort of umbrella of QAnon. So it's a wide range of conspiracies. Supporters believed, and this is really important because it was fun, especially for them, that they're following a trail of breadcrumbs, that they're the ones, as we heard, that they have some special knowledge, some insider game-playing kind of trail of breadcrumbs that are going to reveal the truth about the deep state. They thought they were using clever decoding and puzzle solving, detective work, and over the past 4 or 5 years especially have falsely accused a raft of celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people across the US and elsewhere of being perpetrators or victims of child trafficking, which has led, of course, to tainted reputations, but also to death threats, harassment, kidnappings, and even murders. There were conspiracy-fueled violent attacks in the US on a variety of physical sites believed to be locations where child trafficking was taking place. Most notably, the first one that really brought this to light was the Comet Pizza attack by a man who showed up with a gun. That pizza shop, which I go to often, is less than a kilometer from my house. It's a neighborhood pizza shop that just got identified as part of this conspiracy. And he stormed the pizza shop to rescue children who he thought were being held in the basement. There is no basement in that restaurant, and once he discovered that, thankfully, he surrendered to authorities. But there were other attacks on locations, including the Hoover Dam, a U.S. Navy hospital ship, the home of the Canadian Prime Minister, and the U.S. National Butterfly Center, which was forced to shut down in the wake of threats after it became falsely identified as a migrant trafficking site. QAnon wasn't only focused on child exploitation, and it is not still focused on child exploitation. It was wide-ranging, but those claims about child exploitation did the most harm and continue to do the most harm, and how they have very quickly channeled QAnon into a spiraling network of disinformation and conspiracy theories that actually prevented real victims from getting help. And probably the most well-known example is when a QAnon influencer falsely linked the shopping way site called Wayfair to a child trafficking phenomenon in 2020 by suggesting that home decor products sold with girls' names, like the Amelia couch or the Madison table, that those were actually, and if they were highly priced, that those were actually a false channel. They were a channel for the sale of human children, that the site was being used to sell human children under the guise of product names. Millions of people shared the claims online. They flooded national trafficking hotlines before the claims were actually debunked by Wayfair and the US Department of Homeland Security. And one of the anti-trafficking organizations estimated that the time it took to investigate false Wayfair trafficking claims prevented them from responding to over 42 actual trafficking cases. They had to spend days sort of doing this. So while the Comet Ping Pong Pizza attack, that's the name of the restaurant, sort of raised the first warning signs about the possibility of violence that gets mobilized in serious ways by conspiracy theories, Wayfair, that shopping website incident, showed how quickly millions of people in the mainstream would believe claims that, that were patently untrue, and how quickly the pace and scale of the problem was evolving, how rapidly it could get worse. The Wayfair conspiracy drew millions of new believers into the movement, including one woman who was brought in by the Wayfair conspiracy theory and was later trampled to death on January 6th at the US Capitol. By the fall of 2020, an astonishing 41% of US adults reported believing that, quote, elites, politicians, and/or celebrities are involved in global pedophilia rings, and we need to hashtag save our children. 1 in 5 members, Americans at that time, self-identified as QAnon believers. So 20% actually said they believed QAnon. 41% believed there's some sort of orchestrated global pedophilia ring. By 2022, this had morphed into a larger set of beliefs about orchestration, with 40% of Americans saying it is definitely or probably true that regardless of who is officially in charge of the government and other organizations, there is a single group of people who secretly control events and rule the world together. The problem is particularly strong among American evangelical Christians. In 2023, more than 30% of evangelicals reported believing at least some part of QAnon. And in the 2024 election, we saw very clearly that this still falls along partisan lines, with 80% of registered voters who are QAnon believers saying that they support Trump and vote for Trump in the 2024 election, while the exact opposite was true. Those who reject QAnon, 80% of them say they support Harris. One of the things that happened, I mean, it's hard to overstate the damage that QAnon conspiracies have done to democracy itself, and I want to talk about that in a few minutes. But first, I really want to say something about the integration into the pro-Trump MAGA world and how that created a mainstreaming of conspiracy beliefs even further. So the first thing that happened is that QAnon has channeled a tremendous amount of hateful content that has helped fuel anti-LGBTQ issues by making propaganda and false claims about grooming sort of popular among local communities, the threats of children being groomed to be gay or being groomed for pedophilia. This is linked to the far right's long obsession with child sexual abuse, but it became supersized through QAnon, and it became ultimately a cloak for what has now become a very strong anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ plus scapegoating and fear-mongering happening in the US. We also saw the retweeting of QAnon claims by Trump himself and by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, an elected official in Congress. We had 97 candidates in the 2020 election with ties to QAnon running for office. And ultimately, I think probably the most damaging thing was that this hashtag linking of the mobilization between QAnon's hashtags, which were Save the Children and Stop Human Trafficking, became linked to Stop the Steal and the MAGA worlds through hashtags that ultimately drove and helped drive thousands of QAnon supporters to the Capitol for the rally, and then ultimately to January 6th attack. Part of that in the evangelical part is that it met up with believers in the evangelical world who already believe that there's an apocalyptic end times coming. There's these prophecies that there's going to be a coming biblical storm, And that got linked to the idea that Trump was going to be righteously restored to his truthful place of power as part of this kind of end time. So that explains some of the evangelical. And ultimately, it drove thousands to the Capitol in an attack that still today, 25% of Americans and 33% of Republicans believe was instigated by the FBI. So I want to shift very quickly to talk about anti-feminist, anti-immigrant, and great replacement conspiracy theories. So we're not only talking about QAnon, particularly because our workshop tomorrow is focused on a new tool on anti-feminist and misogynistic conspiracy theories and harms online. But I'll come back at the end briefly to talk about the harms to democracy, because I think it's one of the most important things. So first of all, I want to say 1/3 of Americans overall and 2/3 of Republicans believe some tenets of the Great Replacement, which says that there is an orchestrated effort by Jews and feminists to replace white civilizations with multicultural ones in order to secure more power. We have related to that, I think one of the things we often in the US talk about the anti-Semitic nature of that conspiracy theory and the anti-immigrant nature of that conspiracy theory, but rarely talk about the anti-feminist parts of it, which have to do with the control of women's reproductive, control of their decisions, and the need to secure more white births to counter the Great Replacement. We generally see and have seen for the last several years an increasing prevalence of a wide range of gendered and anti-feminist conspiracy theories. The idea that feminists, including through a cultural Marxist plot in collaboration with universities and Jewish academics, are deliberately and secretly working to undermine traditional values, dismantle families, and enact sinister plots against men to secure power. We know in the research that exposure to gendered conspiracy theories shapes harmful views of violence against women, including the belief that men are victims of false claims of sexual assault, for example. We also know from the research that conspiracy beliefs themselves are associated with a wide range of emotional states that are very frequently evoked in the manosphere and in male supremacist spaces. So things like low self-esteem and interpersonal trust, uncertainty, a lack of personal significance. So the growth of those spaces and the growth of influencers like Andrew Tate, who have drawn boys and young men into those spaces, has also helped fuel some of these conspiracy theories. And finally, on the anti-immigrant side, we see that especially the repeated repetition of false conspiracies and disinformation claims, including things like they're eating the pets from President Trump about immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, have led to real violence, bomb threats, attacks on immigrants, and other forms of violence. So I want to conclude just by saying a little bit about the damage this is doing. I mean, obviously, we see massive effects on the undermining of the ability to distinguish between fact and fiction, and in the support for scientific expertise more broadly. We see those effects in the election. We see those effects in the attacks on science in the US and I think elsewhere, in the attacks on the legitimacy of knowledge and on the independence of it. We have seen conspiracy theories mobilize threats and acts of violence and be exploited by bad actors. So the Proud Boys, for example, and others have issued guidance to followers online on how to attract conspiracy believers into their movements by kind of exploiting the same kinds of fears. And then the hashtag channels, as I talked about, I think are connecting and broadening the movements and drawing, in this case, millions of people in through, by linking up one form of disinformation and conspiracy theories about, say, rigged elections with a second form about child trafficking. We know in the research that belief in conspiracy theories fuels animosity towards scapegoats, especially because they're positioned as a threat, as an existential threat, as malevolent, dishonest enemies who orchestrate politics and society in order to secure power for themselves. And there's three outcomes, I think, that we see very clearly in terms of the risks. One, they are linked to support for violent political actions. Two, they're linked to, they correlate with how morally acceptable people believe violence is for achieving their goals. And third, they are correlated with readiness or intention to engage in violent extremism. So for all those three reasons, even though sometimes people will laugh at the, it just seems so absurd. The National Butterfly Center, like, it really got shut down. I mean, you can't make it up, but it is linked to a number of bad outcomes on the democratic side and also on the prevention of violence. So very quickly, because I was asked to say something about the elections, I will say a couple of things about that and then happy to answer questions. That there has been significant election denialism on the left since November as well, including conspiracies about Trump's win, claims of miscounts, hacks, and stolen elections. We have, I did not even talk about the DEI conspiracy theories, but the diversity, equity, and inclusion conspiracies as linked to the idea of a cultural Marxist plot that is run by so-called Jewish masterminds is very prevalent right now and having very strong effects on the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the idea here is that Marxists failed with the revolution on the sort of physical, there was no successful revolution, and so now the cultural Marxist plot is to secure ideas hegemonically by controlling universities and changing how people think. Often this gets linked to so-called gender ideology, the idea that there is a secret, sinister plot to damage or eradicate the true biological division of the sexes. And so a lot of the attacks, as we've seen in Hungary, but also now in the US, immediately are closing gender studies departments, closing, in the list of words that the National Science Foundation has used to review their grants for compliance with Trump's executive orders, one of those words is woman, right? It's gender. And I will say that initially, a number of grants, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of grants have been canceled from the federal government that have the word diversity in them, including a number of grants that went out to through the U.S. Department of Agriculture on biodiversity, like soil rotation, right? So there's been they were restored after protests from the farmers, but, this is the kind of broad and quick swath, right? How strong the sort of idea of both ideology and conspiracy here. QAnon is weaker. You'll hear me talking in some cases about in the past tense about it, but it's not over. There's still plenty of QAnon believers out there in the U.S., and they're still driving election results. And, this is what I just said about the blurry line between ideology or belief and conspiracies, that the anti-DEI work, the anti-gender ideology work happening at the government level is sometimes rooted in ideology, but often also rooted in conspiracy. The idea that there is an orchestrated effort that is sinister at the hands of women and Jews in particular, usually are the two groups, to undermine power, to secure more power, or to eradicate traditional values. That's usually what the claim is. So I'm going to end there by just saying, and I'll leave this up, tomorrow our workshop is on our new guide together with the Southern Poverty Law Center. We have Lydia Bates here, which is called Not Just a Joke, Understanding and Preventing Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry, which includes a number of anti-feminist conspiracy theories and other conspiracy theories related to it. And all of our tools at parallelresearch.com are free and downloadable, including some that are adapted and tested from the German context, both on the PDF tools and also we have been running a 2-year pilot study testing the mobile Beratung as what we call care centers. in Michigan and Georgia. And my contact information is on my website, along with many of my own articles and essays. And you can also email us at peril@american.edu. So hopefully I didn't talk too fast, but I have maybe a minute or two for questions. Okay.
Vielen Dank, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. Und auch hier haben wir 1 bis 2 Fragen, können wir zulassen. Wer hat eine Frage? Fragen können in Deutsch oder Englisch gestellt werden. Ja, bitteschön. Kollegin kommt mit dem Mikro. Ist für den Livestream tatsächlich besser, deswegen bitten wir Sie.
So, you discussed the gender ideology / anti-Semitic conspiracy and their connection in terms of feeding into each other. One puzzle, or I've always tried to turn this into a research program, is the gendered view of Jewish men. Does it play into it? Say characters as typically feminine, not emasculated, Putins or Trumps? Or
yeah, so great question. So a couple things. One, we came to, in the lab, we now have a division in the lab on anti-Semitism, and we have a division in the lab on the prevention of gendered violence. That's our only 2 thematic divisions. And those came up because we do a lot of mapping of propaganda to create tools, like qualitative and quantitative with scraping, but also coding qualitatively the rhetorical strategies. And the first thing we realized is that anti-Semitic propaganda was always the starting or the end point on basically every type of conspiracy and propaganda that was out there, but very quickly discovered that there was almost always anti-feminist propaganda there too, and conspiracies. Like, they were very closely linked. I haven't noticed it's a good question. I'd like to go back now and look. I haven't noticed the depictions of Jewish men as effeminate. There are, however, depictions of Muslim men as and of men of color in general as sort of hypersexualized. And so you get the threat against white women in particular, and white Christian women as coming from Muslims, immigrants, and men of color, black men in particular. But it may be there, and I just haven't looked at it. It's a good question. We can look. Interesting.
Eine Frage habe ich noch ganz hinten gesehen. Genau, das Mikro kommt sofort.
Yes, I wonder about the line there is between those new kind of theories and those who have it, and actually medically relevant psychosis. And how this is relevant in your field and the one of the professor, and because I have actually sometimes had the idea that we have some kind of a public mental health crisis that's possibly connected to the use of these new communication technologies, and I would like to know what you and maybe people in the field think about this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer on sort of mass psychosis, but I will say there's pretty good research on things like isolation, depression, anxiety. The US research, particularly around boys right now and young men, shows what we're calling the crisis of men and boys, that 50% of American men say their online lives are more rewarding than their offline lives. That's from data last year in 2024. 25% of men under 30 in the US say they don't have a single friend. And 65%, I think it is, of young men between the ages of 18 and 23 strongly agree with the statement that, quote, no one really knows them. And so when you look at that level of isolation, which is much worse than in previous generations, that level of immersion in online worlds where they're not confronted often with other people who think differently than them, or with people who might be meeting them even with empathy or connection, I think we know a lot about the susceptibility of people in those types of situations to feeling special, to feeling connected, to feeling like they're a part of something bigger and better than themselves, that they might have, as we saw from the research, a way to feel like they're smarter than everybody else and they've got something figured out that other people don't. And so even if they're isolated and alone, and that's where I think a lot of the QAnon during the pandemic, it's really important that it was puzzle solving, it was detective work, it was like, you know, a scavenger hunt. And when people were very isolated, and it drew a lot of mothers in who psychologically were quite worried about their own families, and then, you know, can take action, right? It gave them a path to feel like they're doing something when they couldn't protect their own families from COVID, but they can protect these kids who are being trafficked. And as I once said to a journalist, like, if you believed that there were children being trafficked at the pizza shop, that, you know, wouldn't you do something? Like, they did actually, you know, I think a lot of these women in particular who went down the, what we call QAnon pathway, really did believe it. And sometimes they came in through not the typical channels. They came in through alternative medicine routes, like yoga studios, like things that were expressing skepticism about vaccines or about the medical community, and then introduced to this whole world of child trafficking where they felt they had to take action. And that's where when we saw kidnappings of children who people thought were at risk, and from women who were moms, right? Like, it was unusual in the history of other types of violent action. That's, I think, the place to understand that. So it's definitely psychologically related, but I don't know about the question of mass psychosis. I think that's interesting.
Okay, ich habe ja gesagt, wir haben